Mid-air crisis in a plane averted by a 12-year-old. What happened? The morning sun filtered through the massive glass windows of Logan International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished tiles. Travelers bustled past in hurried strides, the clatter of rolling suitcases mingling with boarding announcements and the rhythmic beeping of airport carts. Among the crowd, a slender girl stood quietly beside an older woman, her posture composed, her expression thoughtful. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. 12-year-old Emma Carter didn't fidget like other kids her age. She wasn't glued to a tablet or fussing about snacks. Instead, she held tightly onto a weathered aviation book titled Wings and Wind, The Beginner's Guide to Flight. The cover was creased and faded, with a handwritten note in the inside flap. "For my co-pilot, love, Dad." She glanced down at it once more, the corners of her lips lifting into a subtle smile. Her aunt knelt beside her, adjusting Emma's backpack strap and brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "Text me when you land, all right? And don't forget the snack I packed at the bottom, almond bars, your favorite." Emma nodded. The bond between them was warm but restrained. Since her parents passed, her aunt had taken on the role with grace, never trying to replace her father or mother, only to keep the rhythm of Emma's life steady. As her aunt stood, she placed a firm hand on Emma's shoulder. "You'll be all right, sweetheart. It's just a short flight to Grandma and Grandpa's." "I know," Emma replied, her voice soft but clear. She turned toward the security checkpoint, inhaled deeply, and walked with quiet confidence. No tantrums, no last-minute clinginess. Just the calm stride of a girl used to facing things on her own. Inside the checkpoint, TSA agents guided her through, and she followed the routine like second nature. Shoes off, electronics out, arms raised for the scanner. An older agent glanced down at her ticket, then up at her face. "Traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He smiled. "Well, you're braver than most adults I know." She offered a polite nod before collecting her belongings and heading to gate B22. The terminal buzzed with life. A group of teenagers laughed near the vending machines, a mother rocked a crying baby, and a businessman barked into his phone. Yet Emma walked through the noise like a silent thread moving through fabric, untouched and focused. She found an empty seat near the large windows overlooking the tarmac. Outside, jets taxied in the distance. Her gaze followed one, eyes narrowing slightly as the plane lifted off, wheels retracting into its belly, climbing into the pale blue sky. She traced its motion with a subtle, knowing gaze, one familiar with wind speeds, lift, and yaw. This wasn't just a kid who liked planes. Emma understood them. She didn't dream of flying like most children did. She had studied it. Her father had once turned their garage into a mini flight sim center. Weekends were spent adjusting throttles, reading gauges, and memorizing emergency protocols. "You're a natural," he used to say, watching her fingers move across the controls. "You listen to the sky, Em. That's rare." A notification pinged on the gate monitor. "Flight 427 to Charlotte, on time." A boarding attendant called for pre-boarding. Emma rose, adjusted her backpack, and made her way to the line. The gate agent, noticing the unaccompanied minor label on her pass, greeted her kindly. "You're Miss Emma?" "Yes, ma'am. Come right this way." She followed her onto the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft growing louder with each step. The door to the plane opened, and a smiling flight attendant bent down slightly to greet her. "Hi there, sweetheart. We've got you seated right near the front, seat 3A. Window seat, lucky girl." Emma stepped onto the plane, her sneakers silent on the carpeted floor. The cabin smelled of fabric cleaner and brewed coffee. She made her way to her seat, slipping into it without a word, placing her book carefully in the seat pocket in front of her. The engines vibrated faintly beneath her feet. From her window, she could see the crew loading bags below, airport vehicles circling, a fuel truck disengaging. She adjusted her seatbelt, not out of nerves but habit. Her eyes scanned the overhead panel, air nozzles, reading lights, and seatbelt signs. The pilot's door was still open. She caught a glimpse inside. Rows of buttons, blinking indicators, and two men checking their lists. It felt like home. A mother with a toddler shuffled past her. A couple argued quietly in the row behind. The flight attendants began their safety checks. Emma stayed still, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Her gaze moved from her window to the aisle, then back to the cockpit. She didn't know it yet, but in just a few short hours, She'd be in that very seat, not as a passenger, but as a savior. The door to the cockpit closed with a soft thud. One of the pilot's voices echoed through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 427. We'll be departing shortly, with clear skies all the way to Charlotte." The final passengers boarded. The plane doors were secured. The aircraft pulled away from the gate, slowly taxiing toward the runway. Outside, the airport began to shrink behind them, disappearing into a blur of concrete and motion. Emma leaned her head against the window. The moment the wheels left the ground, her fingers tapped gently on the armrest. 3 beats, then pause. It was something her father used to do whenever they took off. 3 for luck, he called it. And as the clouds swallowed the plane from beneath, Emma Carter settled in, not knowing the unimaginable test of courage that awaited her high above the earth. But the sky already knew. The aircraft sliced effortlessly through the upper atmosphere, cruising at 34,000 feet above a quilt of white clouds. Inside the cabin of Flight 427, calm had settled in like a thick blanket. Seatbelt signs were off, overhead vents whispered cool air, and the dull hum of the engines provided a steady lull. Passengers leaned back into their seats, some drifting into quiet naps while others leafed through magazines or watched silent movies on screens embedded in the seats ahead. The flight attendants wheeled carts slowly down the aisle, smiling politely as they distributed drinks, trays of warm meals, and small packets of pretzels. The scent of coffee mixed with the faint aroma of reheated pasta. In row 3A, Emma Carter held a plastic cup of orange juice with both hands. She hadn't opened her book again. Instead, her eyes watched the patterns of condensation on the window. Her mind wandered, not in daydreams, but in calculation, altitude, heading, wind direction. The rhythm of the flight felt familiar, predictable. Somewhere up front, laughter broke the silence, a pair of businessmen sharing a joke over whiskey. Across the aisle, a young woman gently rocked a fussing baby. Behind Emma, a teenager chuckled through his headphones. Everything was in its right place. There was no hint of what was about to come. In the cockpit, however, the atmosphere was changing. Captain Reynolds had flown this route for years. A seasoned pilot with over 2 decades in the air, he had done this flight so many times he could run the pre-landing checks in his sleep. But today was different. A dull ache had bloomed in his chest earlier, and he'd brushed it off as fatigue. Now, the pressure had spread. Sharp. Tight. His vision blurred for a second. The co-pilot, younger and less experienced, didn't notice at first. He was monitoring fuel levels and adjusting speed. Then came a short, strangled gasp. Reynolds gripped the yoke once, tightly, then collapsed against the side panel with a heavy thud. The co-pilot turned just in time to catch his head slumping forward. "Captain," he said, frozen. No response. Panic began as a drop of sweat at the co-pilot's temple. He reached for the oxygen mask and called out again, louder. Still no response. The monitors blinked steadily, indifferent to the chaos blooming inside the cockpit. Training kicked in, but barely. The co-pilot's fingers hovered over switches and controls he suddenly didn't trust himself to use alone. His hand slammed against the emergency alert button. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere shifted in a second. A single, abrupt jolt rocked the plane. It wasn't violent, but it was unnatural, like a pothole in the sky. A few drinks toppled, a fork clattered to the ground. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The flight attendants exchanged looks and locked their carts into place. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts," came a voice, strained, forced, from the speakers. "We're experiencing a minor technical difficulty." Passengers began to stir. Some followed the instruction without question. Others craned their necks toward the front. A murmur rolled through the rows. That bump hadn't felt minor. And the tone of the voice? It didn't match the words. Emma sat upright, eyes narrowing. She didn't feel fear, not yet. But she knew something was wrong. Her eyes moved instinctively toward the front galley where 2 flight attendants had begun whispering to one another. One of them picked up the intercom handset but didn't speak. The other disappeared quickly behind the curtain separating first class from the cockpit. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt slightly, shifting just enough to peer between the seats ahead. She caught a glimpse of motion of hurried arms and an oxygen tank being rolled past. Another flight attendant came walking quickly down the aisle, nodding to the others as if confirming something only they were allowed to know. Passengers started asking questions. What's going on? Was that turbulence? Why aren't we hearing from the captain? No one had answers. Not even the crew. The young co-pilot, now alone in the cockpit, had placed a frantic call to air traffic control. His hands trembled as he gripped the yoke. He knew the basics. How to keep the plane level, how to stabilize, but emergencies weren't theoretical anymore. They were real. He stared down at the unmoving body of the captain beside him, heart pounding, lungs tight. Meanwhile, the attendants worked overtime to maintain calm. They smiled, even when their lips trembled. They reassured passengers, even as their own eyes flicked constantly toward the cockpit door. Emma sat still, but her mind was anything but. She could feel the shift in altitude. Not dramatic, but inconsistent. The plane was floating, not flying. Maintaining direction, but not with intent. The pilot's voice hadn't returned, and that silence said more than any announcement could. She leaned back in her seat but didn't relax. Her breathing slowed. She pressed her palm against the wall beside her window, counting the seconds between small altitude corrections. Something about the rhythm was off. The plane wasn't dropping, but it wasn't ascending confidently, either. It was stalling in spirit. She glanced down at the book in the seat pocket. Her father's handwriting. His lessons. What would he do right now? Her fingers twitched. Her shoulders squared. At the front of the cabin, one of the attendants finally stepped out from behind the curtain. Her face was pale, her composure cracking ever so slightly. She approached the other crew member near the intercom and whispered. From her position, Emma caught a single phrase. For words that would ripple across the rest of her life, the pilot's gone down. A cold wave ran through her. Not fear. Focus. Emma didn't know how. But deep inside, she felt the weight of the moment shifting toward her. Like gravity had picked her from the crowd. The tension in the cabin had thickened into something you could almost touch. Passengers murmured, clutched armrests, exchanged nervous glances. The plane still flew level, but uncertainty now rode along with everyone on board. Then came the sound. The ding of the intercom cut through the noise. A flight attendant's voice, trembling but urgent, filled the cabin. If there's anyone on board with flight experience, anyone with training, please press your call button immediately. Silence. Dozens of faces turned, looking at one another, waiting for someone, anyone to react. A retired pilot, maybe. A military veteran. A seasoned traveler with more than just frequent flyer miles. Nothing. Row by row, the absence of response sank in like cold water. Emma Carter's fingers hovered over the button beside her seat. Her heart thumped. No one was stepping up. Everyone was waiting. Her thumb pressed the button. A quiet chime signaled her call. A nearby flight attendant turned, clearly surprised to see it was a child. She approached quickly, kneeling beside Emma's seat, her voice hushed. You rang. Emma nodded. I can help. I've trained on simulators. My dad taught me. He was an Air Force pilot. The attendant blinked. Sweetheart, this is a real aircraft. I know, Emma said, cutting her off gently but firmly. But if no one else can help, I can at least try. The woman hesitated, eyes scanning the cabin again. Still no raised hands. Still no volunteers. Desperation won out over protocol. Come with me, she whispered. Emma rose. I seemed to follow her as she stepped into the aisle. A dozen confused looks, a few smirks of disbelief. But none of that mattered to her. The air near the cockpit felt colder somehow, as if she were crossing into another world. The flight attendant drew the curtain aside. Emma stepped through. The door opened, and the co-pilot turned around with eyes wide, expecting a fellow officer or flight-trained adult. Instead, he saw a girl. Just a girl. But she didn't flinch. Her posture straightened, gaze steady. She says she's trained, the attendant offered. Simulators. Her dad was military. The co-pilot looked like he wanted to protest, but the chaos had drained that luxury. The moment demanded action, not doubt. He motioned her forward. Emma stepped into the cockpit, the door closing behind her. Her breath caught for a second. The space was tighter than she imagined, louder too. Lights blinked across the console. The captain remained unconscious, slumped against the side panel. Emma's eyes darted over the controls, overwhelming at first, but familiar in their structure. The co-pilot pressed a headset into her hands. Sit here, he said, motioning to the jump seat behind him. Put this on. We're going to need every bit of calm you've got. Emma slid into the seat and pulled the headset over her ears. A sharp voice crackled through. Air traffic control, asking for updates, altitude, fuel status. The co-pilot barked responses, his voice frayed. Then he paused. turned to her. Have you ever flown a 737 sim before? Yes, she replied. A dozen times. My dad ran me through every scenario, including emergencies. He stared at her, this strange, composed child, then nodded once. All right, Emma, let's keep this bird in the air. She didn't answer. She simply placed her hands near the throttle and began watching the altimeter. Her father's voice echoed in her head. You don't fly the plane. You listen to it. And now, at 34,000 feet, Emma Carter began to listen. The cockpit trembled slightly, then again a harder. A low rumble swept through the fuselage as the plane cut into a patch of dense, churning clouds. The once clear skies had given way to dark gray masses that curled and twisted like smoke, wrapping around the aircraft with unwelcome force. Inside, Emma gripped the armrest beside her seat. Her knuckles whitened. The view outside the cockpit windshield had become a blur of mist and streaks of lightning. She couldn't see the horizon anymore, just endless gray and brief, blinding flashes. The plane shook again, this time enough to lift a pin off the control panel. Emma flinched. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the instruments, momentarily unsure of where to begin. Her heart pounded. She could feel it in her throat. The console in front of her pulsed with glowing numbers and blinking lights, 1,000 things demanding her attention all at once. But then came the voice. Not from the headset. Not from the co-pilot. From memory. Breathe first. Think second. Act third. That's the order, Em. Always. Her father's voice. Calm. Assured. Emma inhaled slowly through her nose, held it, then exhaled. The trembling in her fingers eased. Her shoulders loosened. She looked again, not at the storm, not at her fear, but at the instruments. The altimeter. The attitude indicator. The heading. One by one, she read them, cross-checked them, reoriented. She was back. Beside her, the co-pilot wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He had been multitasking far beyond his limits, juggling systems, radio calls, and the weight of 172 souls on board. He turned to Emma, eyes red from stress. They want us to descend, he said hoarsely. We're cleared for runway 17 at Harris Field. Emma nodded. What's our descent rate target? 1,800 feet per minute. But I'm losing pitch control. You'll have to manage the trim and throttle. He didn't say more. He didn't question her age or ability. Not anymore. The plane dropped slightly, catching a current that rattled overhead bins and jolted seabacks. Far behind the locked cockpit door, passengers cried out. One tray clattered to the floor. A child wailed. The fear had crept from quiet worry to open panic. In row 12, a man pulled out his phone and started recording, his camera shaking slightly as he whispered, They say a kid is flying the plane. A little girl. God help us. Another passenger clasped her hands in prayer. Others pressed heads to knees, whispering softly to themselves. The fear was contagious, but so was the growing rumor. A child is in the cockpit. A girl. No way. That can't be real. But it was. And behind the controls, Emma stayed fixed on her task. Her voice was clear now. Measured. She read back instructions from air traffic control with precision, fingers adjusting the throttle gently, guiding the descent. Her left hand fine-tuned the trim, her right monitoring the yoke, steady as the plane dipped beneath the storm line. Altitude holding at 19,000, she confirmed. The co-pilot blinked. You've got a feel for this. She didn't answer. She was busy, focused. The clouds began to thin. The first glimpse of open sky appeared, faint sunlight breaking through just ahead, and beneath them, the outline of land and blinking runway lights began to emerge through the haze. The storm was behind them. But the landing was still ahead. Emma didn't flinch. She listened to the plane, to the sky, and to the voice that lived in her memory. The girl who had boarded quietly was gone. In her place sat a pilot. The runway loomed ahead, two long stripes painted across the earth like a finish line drawn by fate. The descent was steady but tense, the nose of the aircraft dipping slightly with each minor correction. From the cockpit, Emma could now see the blinking red and white lights of emergency vehicles gathered like sentinels, waiting just beyond the tarmac. Speed's a little high, the co-pilot murmured, his voice barely audible above the layered sounds of wind resistance and hydraulic hum. We'll need to flare early. Emma nodded. Her fingers adjusted the throttle, heart pounding with every passing second. The airport tower's voice crackled in her headset, but it was distant now, almost unimportant. Her world had narrowed to the instruments, the horizon line, and the feel of the aircraft beneath her. The tires screeched. A hard bump jolted the cabin as the wheels slammed into the runway. The entire fuselage rattled for a moment, every loose object vibrating against its restraints. The left side dipped slightly, then righted. Brakes engaged. Reverse thrusters howled like caged beasts. They were down. The aircraft rolled forward, slowing by the second, until it came to a long, breathless stop near the far edge of the strip. A heavy silence filled the cabin, one last beat of stunned disbelief. Then, applause erupted. It started small, a single clap, then another, before bursting into a wave of cheers, cries, and uncontrollable sobs. Some passengers stood despite the seatbelt sign still glowing. Others simply held their heads in their hands, unable to do anything but weep. Inside the cockpit, Emma's hands finally dropped to her lap. She stared ahead, blinking at the windshield as if the world outside had gone unreal. The co-pilot turned toward her, his eyes glassy. "You saved us," he whispered. He didn't wait for permission. He reached out and pulled her into a tight, trembling hug. It wasn't a formality. It wasn't gratitude from duty. It was the desperate, genuine embrace of someone who had seen the abyss and been brought back by the most unlikely of heroes. Outside, the flurry of movement began. Emergency responders swarmed the aircraft, checking wheels, engines, exits. Ambulances stood by, lights flashing but sirens off. Cameras blinked in the distance. A long lens captured the cockpit window just as Emma leaned forward, her face pale and drawn, framed by the headset still looped around her neck. The cabin doors opened. First responders stepped aboard, met with a sea of grateful, stunned passengers. The crew pointed toward the cockpit. "She's the one," someone said. "The girl. The child who flew the plane." Phones rose into the air. Someone shouted her name. But Emma didn't hear much. The sound around her was muffled now, her body heavy with the aftershock. Her fingers still felt the vibration of the yoke. Her knees wobbled slightly as she stepped into the sunlight for the first time since takeoff. A voice pierced the chaos. "Emma." She turned. Her aunt rushed across the tarmac, escorted by two officials. Tears streaked her face as she flung her arms around Emma, pulling her in with fierce, shaking hands. Emma held on just as tightly. "I thought I'd lost you," her aunt breathed. "I didn't let go," Emma replied softly. Nearby, news crews clamored to get closer. A journalist held up a tablet. On the screen, a grainy video was already circulating. A girl in a headset, sitting in a cockpit, guiding a commercial jet through storm-torn skies. The title below it read, "12-year-old hero saves Flight 427. Emma glanced at the screen. Her image stared back. She hadn't meant to go viral. She only meant to land. And she did. The morning after the landing, Emma Carter sat curled up on the living room couch, wrapped in a thick blanket that barely warmed her trembling hands. The events from the day before played on loop across every major news channel. Headlines scrolled beneath videos of flashing runway lights, stunned passengers, and distant shots of the girl who had flown a plane through a storm. 12-year-old hero saves Flight 427. She just stepped up. Co-pilot describes harrowing descent, miracle in the skies. Emma watched in silence, a mug of untouched hot chocolate resting on her knee. Her aunt sat beside her, gently rubbing her back, still processing everything. Phones hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters, school officials, even former pilots trying to reach out. The world had woken up to her name. But none of it felt real. She had been in that cockpit. She had heard the silence of a man unconscious. She had felt the weight of 172 lives pushing down on her young shoulders. What she did hadn't been about cameras or headlines. It had been survival. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door, followed by silence. Her aunt stood up cautiously, peeking through the curtain. She blinked, then gasped. "Emma," she said, "you might want to come here." Emma rose slowly, her legs still aching from adrenaline and exhaustion. She stepped forward, unsure what to expect. At the door stood 2 men in dark suits. One held a sealed envelope. The other wore a pin, a small American flag on his lapel. "Miss Carter," one of them asked kindly, "we're with the Office of Presidential Communications. The president would like to speak with you directly." Emma froze. The agent handed over the envelope. Her aunt opened it beside her, reading aloud, "You are formally invited to the White House to be honored for your extraordinary courage and composure under pressure." The president wishes to meet you personally. They both looked up, stunned. An hour later, they were on a government-chartered vehicle, escorted by security to a private airfield. Emma remained quiet the entire ride, her mind drifting between the roar of an aircraft and the click of the landing gear. By afternoon, they arrived in Washington, D.C., greeted by aides who ushered them through security and into the heart of the most powerful building in the country. The White House was grand, yet somehow quieter than she expected. The hallways were long and echoing, lined with portraits of leaders and moments carved into history. Emma walked through them, her own footsteps soft against the polished floor. Her hand brushed the edge of her sweater where the cockpit headset had once hung. At last, the doors opened. Inside the East Room, press waited in respectful silence. Cameras clicked softly as Emma stepped forward. The President of the United States approached her with an outstretched hand and an expression of admiration not forced, but genuine. "Emma Carter," he said warmly, shaking her hand. "You did something extraordinary. You showed the world that courage isn't defined by age." He turned to the room and continued. In the face of fear, she chose focus. In the absence of leadership, she became it. And because of her, hundreds of families were spared the unthinkable. He pinned a small medal to her lapel, a national award for bravery. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Emma stood still, overwhelmed but composed. Not for the cameras, not for the moment, because somewhere in the back of her mind, she still heard the voice that had guided her through the storm. Breathe first. Think second. Act third. And that's exactly what she did. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you are watching from, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Mention names of the characters in the story, like brave young Emma, her supportive aunt, and the overwhelmed co-pilot who learned to trust her. What part moved you the most? Would you have reacted like Emma in the cockpit? We'd love to hear your reactions. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories of courage, hope, and the extraordinary moments that change lives forever.